Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining our webinar today. We will be starting shortly, but I just want you all to take note of two things. One, that only panelists and moderators will be able to turn on their cameras and speak. However, we want to keep this an incredibly interactive session, so the Q&A box is open. Please continue sending in your questions throughout the webinar, and we'll get to them either verbally or we will respond in the chat box. Okay, so since we have attendees from all different time zones, I'm sure they'll continue joining. But let's move on. I'll walk you all through the agenda and then we'll dive straight into the webinar. So, yeah, I hope the screen is visible to everyone. So we will begin the webinar today with a welcome address from our program director, Faiza Jamil. After that, we're going to have a short, quick debrief on COP28, following which we're going to just review the impact that we've created in 2023, and then we'll get to the fun, exciting part that I'm sure all of you are waiting for, our panels. We have three panels today. One is on biomass, the other one is on science-based targets, and the third one is on renewable energy certificates. And then we're going to end with Faiza sharing our vision and plans for 2024. I think without further ado, let's start. Faiza, handing it over to you for the welcome address.
Thank you so much, Usman. Thank you everyone for joining today. So even though Usman has introduced me already, I'm going to just do the honors myself again. I'm Syeda Faiza Jamil, the Program Director at Pakistan Environment Trust. And it is incredible. It is truly an honor for me to welcome each and every one of you to this important webinar on climate action. Today, we have gathered some of the brightest minds and leading experts to delve into critical topics that are shaping the future of our planet. This is a very important webinar in the sense that not only we want to emphasize Net Zero Pakistan's work in the context of climate action, but also lay bare the very important connection between the financial stability and the climate action that the PET is really focused on. So our value proposition always has been that we don't emphasize on climate action for the sake of it, even though it's a very noble cause in itself, but also because this is really one of the levers that we can use to bring in economic prosperity into the country. So that is the sort of like I would say the value proposition of PET, and the agenda of the webinar is also kind of organized along this theme. Even though Uswa has run through the webinar agenda, but one thing that I like to emphasize is that one of the key sort of highlight of today's webinar is the impact report discussion that Wardah will be leading on during one of the session. Net Zero Pakistan has been around for almost more than 2 years now, and we have made incredible strides in climate action, in the climate space in Pakistan. So just kind of revisiting the journey, the ups and downs, the learnings that we have made, and the impact that we have created would be very useful to look into. I think these learnings, together with what is happening on the global scenario, which Saif is going to give us a debrief on what is happening on the COP28 front, like what the general trend in terms of the global direction is, and then we can actually sort of position Pakistan in that scenario and see what the way forward should be. In addition to this, there are certain topics that are of very keen interest to our audience, including, for example, we receive a lot of questions around what RECs are, what does the market look like, where do we go from here, where do we stand, and is there something in RECs for us, for example? These are the questions that come in, and we have very esteemed panelists to kind of talk about this subject and bring you up to date on that topic. Similarly, some of you might already be aware that we are also working on with our members on helping them to set and submit their science-based targets. And this is one of the very, I would say, again, a technical area that needs some insights. And we will also be talking about our progress and plans in this particular piece of work. The other and the most, I would say, mega project that we want to discuss is the establishment of the national level biomass supply chain, the project that we very kind of endearingly call BioVentures. And the progress around it, where we are at with BioVentures, what is the potential, and what is the ask of Net Zero Pakistan from our member companies and general stakeholders at large. So this is how the webinar would look like today. I would kind of hand it over to Saif for the COP debrief and circle back to this conversation towards the end of the webinar. But thank you so much all for joining, and really excited about the event today.
Yeah, Faiza, thank you so much for having me. I'm going to share a bit of a COP debrief, but also just a general debrief of the changes we've seen in the ecosystem over the past year. If anyone has any questions, please feel free to put them in the chat, and I'll also try and get to them as well at the end. So from a COP perspective, just thinking about the big milestone coming out of the actual event, the actual negotiations, really it boils down to one big thing, which is a consensus on the need to transition away from fossil fuels in a just, orderly, and equitable manner. This is the highlight, the main accomplishment of the negotiations. For many stakeholders, this seems not far enough, and the language should have been stronger, the pace should have been higher. At the same time, for many other stakeholders, this is in itself a very big milestone and quite historic in that the global community has never really agreed to this sort of consensus. And I think 200 companies basically all united behind this. In parallel with this sort of headline, I think that anyone who was at COP will agree with me when I say that this was probably the most corporate COP that we've ever had. There were around 70,000 participants. Almost every company that I know of was represented. Many sectors had representation at the CEO level, particularly banks. I think pretty much every CEO of every major bank in the world was at COP. And there was a lot of, let's say, a lot of corporate deal making, a lot of corporate progress as well at COP. I see sort of two stakeholder groups over the past 12 months that have already started moving ahead further than the COP community. So moving ahead further than the average or further than the global community. One group is individual governments and regional blocs. So obviously everyone here is familiar with the progress that's being made in the EU. CBAM, or the Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism, is one kind of big regulatory shift. Another is the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive. And there's a big expectation that there's going to be a lot of work that will need to be done in the corporate space over next year just to comply with these two. Anecdotally, what I'm seeing in our business, Altruistiq, which is a software provider in the sustainability space, we're seeing that any company that is involved in trading and commodities, so bringing commodities into Europe, is already starting to look at transaction-based emissions accounting, which means they want to see if they're bringing X amount of commodity weight into the continent, what is the carbon emissions of that transaction coming in. The leaders are already trying to get systems in place for that. And I would expect that in a year's time or 2 years' time, there's a fair bit of momentum behind that. The initial targets of the CBAM mechanism, the Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism, are heavy materials. So think of like steel, cement, fertilizer, etc. But there's an expectation that this will be expanded. When we speak with retailers, grocery brands in Europe, everyone is talking about the EU digital passporting scheme, which is still in development. But the expectation is that in the next few years, you should have full traceability across the supply chain. Where potentially a consumer could scan a QR code on a product and get a full digital traceability that is built on top of a central data system for the EU, which means that if you buy, let's say, a can of baked beans, let's say in a grocery store, then actually all the individual elements of that have come into the EU are all logged, and the carbon footprint is kind of all logged and available. There's a lot of momentum also within individual regulatory bodies in that direction. In the UK, for example, the Food Standard Agency is already defining what that would look like for food. Alongside the EU, the US is still catching up with the implications of the Inflation Reduction Act. Massive subsidies, I think over $500 billion available. A lot of that is now starting to filter through. Just a few weeks ago, I was at a big conference in the US with most of the major corporations, and just the scale of activity and the scale of investment is massive. In the UK, what would be a £10 million investment, in the US is $500 million investment taking place. The other really interesting set of movers in the regulatory space are India and China. The indications are that both India and China are seeing sustainability, and in particular, the energy transition, as a massive strategic priority. And the goal for them is to play into the provision of materials and innovations and technology to be part of that transition. So for China, a big part of that is how do they play into providing battery materials into lithium-ion batteries? How do they play into providing rare earth metals, etc.? And for them to be credible in that, they are also trying to be a demand driver. What I mean by that is that China is increasingly trying to play into the demand drivers of electric transport and renewable energy to create more demand for the raw materials and inputs that they are also playing a role in providing. And so it is increasingly in China's interest to really catalyze both sides of that, supply and demand, for the energy transition. Similarly, in India, India seems to have made a very top-down commitment from the PM level to transition India towards renewable energy and build this as a big strategic advantage for India. Whether it's, again, very similar to China in the creation of electric transport, renewable energy across the country, but also potentially the export of renewable energy at scale, the export of materials, export of technology. What I would expect for any textile companies, for instance, in the conversation here, is that there will be a massive advantage coming to all Indian manufacturers. If I share a bit of light coming from my part of the market, again, as a software provider, we support companies with emissions calculations, which means that, whether it's a big apparel company or a big food company, we're running all of the emissions calculations for individual products and individual activities. And if you think about the different countries supplying products into those companies, there is a natural disadvantage for companies where the energy system is fossil fuel based, versus for countries where the energy system and the grid is increasingly decarbonized. And so what most of our customers are looking at is they're expecting India to decarbonize over the next 10 years, which means that they will increasingly start thinking about transitioning volume of their purchases to countries which are on a decarbonization pathway. India is a good example of that, but also Vietnam, even Bangladesh, for instance, are very rapidly coming up on the radar. I was speaking with the chair of Patagonia, the apparel brand, just 2 days ago. And what he was telling me is that they are now asking all of their major suppliers to commit to renewable energy transition, and they are very actively shifting volume. He, in fact, even mentioned that in some cases, for instance, in Bangladesh, they think that there is no excuse anymore for suppliers not to be transitioning. And so they are increasingly setting this as a hard requirement. I think that's a shift that we hadn't seen a year ago. On the corporate front, I think what we're finding is that large corporations are engaging in two kinds of shifts. One is that almost every single large company now has a sustainability strategy, and they are actively working on aligning their supply chains. I know that there's been a lot of talk in some pockets of the world about corporations pulling back and corporations now kind of, retrenching a little from their commitments. I actually kind of want to really reassure you that this is not happening in actual fact. I think what we saw was that 2-3 years ago, the commitment was huge and the operational transition was very low. What we're seeing now is that the commitment is lower, but the operational transition is much higher. And so just to maybe say that a different way, if you look at a company like Unilever, what Unilever was putting out into the public space in terms of commitment 3-4 years ago was an unrealistic, massive commitment that no one expected them to actually achieve. What they were doing operationally was probably 50% of what they're doing now. And so the actual practice is much higher. Unilever has already made a set of 400 or 500 key suppliers that supply the most material contribution to their emissions footprint. Johnson & Johnson is doing exactly the same. Procter & Gamble is doing exactly the same. And they're actively engaging those top 400 suppliers in workshops to understand what their sustainability transition pathway is. And what they're saying is, we want to understand the emissions footprint of your products and what you're selling to us. We want to understand the initiatives that you're deploying to transition. And not now, but in 2-3 years, we will start making procurement decisions on the basis of that data. And that is a very different shift. It's not just the Nestle's and the Procter & Gamble's. I spoke with one of the largest meat companies in the US just a few weeks ago. Meat is traditionally a very backward industry from a sustainability perspective, and the US meat industry is traditionally one of the most backward globally. This company is huge. It does $50 billion worth of revenue. Its emissions footprint is around 90 million tons, 90, literally almost the entire footprint of Pakistan for this one company. And they are actively working on their transition plans at the level of the individual slaughterhouse. So the actual progress is massive. Companies that were leading the charge have become much more focused and are now looking to product level sustainability and active procurement decisions. I don't know, Faiza, if I have time to share a quick slide. Just give me a nod if yes.
Yes.
All right, good. But I kind of want to maybe just show like a little visualization of how we see the corporate industry journey taking place. Most companies that we know are in this first phase, which is where they're currently still building. They're digitizing. You'll have companies asking you for your emissions number if you're supplying into them. And they just want the data. They're not making real decisions on it yet. They're focusing on only 1 or 2 categories. So emissions is top priority, but water is rapidly coming into this. We work with one of the largest coffee companies in the world, in fact, the largest coffee company in the world. And they're looking at not just scope 1 and 2 for water, but they want to understand embedded water in the coffee beans that they're buying. And what you're looking at now is an expectation where your customers, if you're supplying in as material providers, your customers will be asking you what systems you have running, and potentially even whether they can integrate their systems with yours. We're seeing this already with Unilever globally. One of our customers is a big dairy provider into Unilever, and Unilever now pulls via API the emissions data for the specific products that dairy provider supplies. They pull it into Unilever's system, which means that you actually have product level interaction. If you think of that dairy supplier is one of the largest dairy suppliers, but not the top 2 or 3. However, that dairy supplier is now on the radar of Unilever at a senior level because they're differentiated by their ability to collaborate on data. And that's an important shift that we're seeing in the supply chain. The next shift that we see, which is already happening, frankly, and will happen more and more next year, is the movement to product level carbon footprints. Right now, most of the people in this room are probably still, to some extent, thinking about corporate footprints, but the shift already, especially in the EU, is now towards product environmental footprints at the level of the individual stock keeping unit. The standards coming in will be based on the EU product environment footprint standard, and there's increasing momentum behind that. You're going to see a lot of supply chain collaboration being piloted. Anyone in the textile space will have seen the announcements from H&M with this big collaboration in Bangladesh. And what you see there is a company taking a national view, a system-wide view. And that's in some ways very exciting. Like, if you look at it from the H&M perspective or the global perspective, it's very exciting. If I was a Pakistan-specific producer, I would be terrified. Because what that actually means is that you're seeing a whole rival country producer shifting in collaboration with their biggest customers. There is a big strategic play there that I think any Pakistan-centric producer should be very conscious of. And then finally, this is where we know that the big brands are expecting to land in this improved territory, where they want to move towards pricing in a differentiated way based on the product. To give you an example, Pepsi right now has an internal carbon price of $50 per ton, which means that their internal benchmark of what carbon costs in the business is $50 per ton. And so when they look at any interventions, electrifying transport, shifting the potatoes for their potato chips to regenerative agriculture, they're comparing the cost to a $50 per ton threshold price. And what we're expecting is that that threshold price will become much more specific for companies as they start to get better data, and they will be able to blend that in to their procurement models. And we're already seeing some of that thinking start to take place. And then you'll start to have these more holistic interventions where companies are able to collaborate with their suppliers on specific changes. Let me maybe kind of just briefly wrap up, right? But I kind of want to summarize with a few implications for Pakistan that I see. One is that I think that most companies in Pakistan will start to feel sustainability reporting requirements hitting them, if not already, then within the next 18 months. And I think this will hit three categories of company. One is multinationals. Anyone who is owned by a European business or even a US business, and progressively even a Chinese business, will start to feel these requirements because the EU regulation will capture any subsidiaries in other countries. And we're already seeing this. The second is any companies that have a significant minority shareholding from an investment fund based in Europe and progressively also based in the US. And this will capture another big set of businesses in Pakistan. And the third, and this I think will capture most SMEs or most small enterprises, is any company supplying either of the first two categories. So if you're, let's say, a chemical provider and you're supplying Unilever, or you're a materials provider and you're local, but you're supplying a company that is owned by a European fund, again, you'll be captured anyway because the regulation will cascade. And I think that's a big implication that most businesses aren't aware of. If I look a little more at the plus side, and then I'll wrap up, I think there are two opportunity types for us to maybe win out of this. One is there's massive investment opportunity on the table, especially in anything to do with the energy transition. So renewable energy, whether it's on-site or off-site, battery storage, hydrogen, any variation of the energy transition space right now is an investable theme and is attracting money. If you look at just one of the new pools of capital that has come up, the Altera fund by the UAE government is $30 billion. That is more or less the starting play. It's only going to grow from there. If you look at dedicated climate funds, we're talking about over $100 billion dedicated for energy transition finance. And the scarcity of opportunity will be in countries like Pakistan. Countries like Pakistan are the new territory, the new frontier for that. Anything in this space, I think if you have a project, a corporate project or anything adjacent, it's a good time for that. The second, I think, is supply chain differentiation. And so the first lever, if you're supplying into a corporate based in Europe or elsewhere, the first lever for you is going to be increasing share of wallet. If you are a forward-leaning sustainability player and the emissions intensity of your product is lower than the industry benchmark, you have an opportunity to increase the share of wallet at the same price. Just capture volume from your competing players, increase the share of wallet. Later on, you'll have an opportunity for increased margin through pricing differentiation as well. And I think that if you prepare for both the short term and the medium term, I think you'll emerge as winners out of this. I'm going to stop there. I'm going to try and look at the questions raised as well in the meantime, but hopefully that was a bit helpful to those joining.
Thank you so much for these extensive insights, Saif. Yes, there are questions and you can respond to them in the chat box. Given how polarizing the COP28 has been, the pertinent question for our webinar today is, what does it mean for Pakistan and especially Pakistan businesses? And you've given us much to think about and reflect on. And if there's anything that COP has taught us, it is to do more in terms of translating our words into actions. And in that spirit, I would like to call upon Wardah Zaman, who is a program manager at Pakistan Environment Trust, to give us a snapshot of the impact that we have created in 2023. Wardah, over to you.
Thanks so much, Uswa. I'm just going to quickly share my screen because I'll be sharing Net Zero Pakistan's progress in the past year. Just let me know if my screen is visible. Great. Okay, So we're very excited to share quite a few updates on what Net Zero Pakistan has been working on in the past year. And I do firstly want to thank our partners that made it possible. And most importantly, I think our Net Zero Pakistan members have had a huge role to play in everything that we've done, because it's only been possible because of the commitment that they've made to net zero. So the first thing that we're really excited to share has been our effort with our member companies on our flagship project for understanding how we can set up a biomass supply chain in Pakistan. When we set up Net Zero Pakistan, one of our priorities was to really understand what are the main decarbonization priorities for our companies, our member companies, which are majority in the textile sector. And the feedback that we got was that thermal energy is a huge area for concern. And when you look at the entire textile value chain, in fabric processing, 90% of emissions come from thermal energy. So that became a priority for us because it was a priority for our member companies. And we had a lot of questions that we got that, biomass is maybe not the best alternative to thermal energy. What else can we look at? How can we make sure that biomass is consistently available throughout the year? So there were so many questions to be explored, which is why we launched a feasibility study this year for a $10.5 million project on setting up this entire supply chain through a pilot initiative. The feasibility is going to be wrapped up in a year, and we're very excited to share insights when it is wrapped up. But so far, we know that it has the potential to reduce 15 metric tons of emissions over a period of 10 years. And I think that's very exciting given that this has been a priority for the sector. And we will be likewise looking into more large-scale decarbonization projects throughout the year. Another exciting update, which again has been a priority, has been around Scope 2 targets, which is on how can our member companies and just broadly Pakistan's industry really meet their renewable energy targets. Because one problem that comes up, not just in Pakistan, but outside Pakistan as well, is if you're using energy from the grid, you don't have control over the energy mix of the grid. And if you have such stringent renewable energy targets to completely achieve 100% renewable energy by 2030, it becomes very impossible, which is why there are mechanisms like renewable energy certificates available. And PET is the sole issuer for RECs in the country. We are accredited by the IREC Foundation, which is also going to be a panelist in our webinar today. And we're so excited to share that this year we issued 96,000 megawatt hours of RECs, which have generated $0.5 million in capital towards renewable energy providers. And this is something I really want to point out, that this is not just a way for companies to meet their Scope 2 targets, but this is also a way to incentivize renewable energy production in the country. So the fact that all of this capital actually went towards renewable energy providers is a humongous way that we want to really incentivize more and more renewable energy providers to really scale up and achieve the kind of impact that we can in terms of increasing renewable energy in the country. Next, I also want to talk about the knowledge and capacity building that we've done for our companies. One of the things that we are very proud to share is the fact that our companies, all of them have committed to science-based targets, so that they are not just talking about any net zero targets, because often that's a very loose word that's thrown around. But the fact that they've committed to SDPI is something that we're very proud of. And we're excited to share that by the end of this year, 7 member companies of ours will have submitted their SDPI targets. And that partly has been in collaboration with MyCarbon, who is also our partner, and will be you'll hear from later today in a webinar. And one of our member companies has actually had their targets approved, which is Interloop, and we're really, really proud because they have been a leader in the industry and have shown what our industry is capable of. So we're very proud with this progress, especially considering Pakistan is a developing country, and you don't see a lot of developing country companies working on SDPI. We've had 5 town halls with our member companies where we get together and understand how we can focus on decarbonization. We're really happy that one of the key areas of focus had been flag emissions, which is forestry, land use, and agriculture, because that has become a priority in the global landscape, and we want to make sure that our companies are addressing the upcoming priorities. Lastly, on knowledge, we have developed 6 knowledge assets. One of them or more of them are available on our website. We have a net zero toolkit, which is the A to Z for any company in terms of understanding how they can scale up a sustainability division in their company. We also have a net zero course, which is exclusive for our members, that helps companies train any of their sustainability employees or any new employee that has joined the sustainability team. Lastly, I want to talk about how we represented Pakistan's textile sector and just broadly the Net Zero Pakistan platform on 7 prestigious international forums, which include the Global Fashion Summit, the Innovation Forum, COP28, and many more, where we want to make sure that we are putting forward the narrative that Pakistan is very serious about sustainability. There's a lot of work that is happening, and we want to make sure that it is visible to all of our key stakeholders internationally and locally. So with that, I would like to conclude my wrap up. I'm happy to answer any questions in the Q&A. I also want to share the QR code for our impact report, which is on our website, but you can also scan and download, or you can reach out to us on this email with any questions that you may have as well. Over to you, Uspa. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Wardah. I think your presentation gives us the much needed hope that we need during these times where pessimism usually clouds conversations around climate change in Pakistan. And on that note, I want to take this forward and present our first panel, which is going to explore the potential of biomass in Pakistan. For that, I would like to call upon Osman Idris, the head of decarbonization at Pakistan Environment Trust. Osman, over to you.
Thanks, Usha. So let me start with a brief intro into biomass before we delve deeper into this with our panelists. So what is this buzz about biomass basically? So biomass is a renewable and environmentally friendly alternate to traditional fossil fuel usage. So when we are using biomass, we can create a cleaner environment, promote economic growth, and build a more resilient textile and apparel industry in Pakistan. PET, as a matter of fact, is itself in the process of setting up a formal biomass fuel supply chain from agricultural waste in Punjab. So this will be used to provide alternate fuel to industrial off-takers, mainly consisting of textile and apparel, for use in process such as steam generation to replace fossil fuels. This is the first of its kind project in Pakistan, and we're really excited about it. And it has the potential to reduce GHG emissions by around 15 metric tons over a period of 10 years. So how can it help us achieve a breakthrough in reducing GHG emissions in the textile and apparel sector? To get answer to this question, let's move to the 2 experts that have joined us today for this panel. Mustafa from US Apparel and Trina from Institute for Sustainable Communities. Thank you both for being a part of this webinar. Mustafa is working as GM Sustainability at US Apparel and Textiles and has over 15 years of experience working in different domains in the textile and apparel sector. In his current role, Mustafa is responsible for leading the company's sustainability strategy, policies, and products to align it with global practices and standards. Trina Mallik is Vice President of Global Programs at Institute for Sustainable Communities and oversees the Institute's program in Bangladesh, China, India, Thailand, US, and countries across Asia. Previously, Trina has served as a climate change consultant for a number of multinational companies, working with Allianz and PwC beforehand. So, Mustafa, my first question is for you. How do you see the role of biomass in shaping a sustainable supply chain, particularly in the context of Pakistan?
Thank you, Usman. I think for textiles, it's a matter of choice as well. So for us, when we talk about renewable energy, we have limited access when it comes to a huge proportion of solar or other energy sources, and grid is something, as very rightly pointed out by Wardah, would be something not in our control. So we see biomass as our only way out at the moment to green our energy use. Unfortunately, what we are now missing out on is the fact that biomass is right now helping the textile industry more towards the energy section, not the electricity section. So we're converting our boilers, existing boilers, or we're procuring boilers that can generate steam from biomass. And I think one of the things that we're now still struggling with, and I think most of these standards are also struggling out there, is if to take 100% of that as carbon neutral. Now, we often get confused with the fact that renewable does not automatically translates into 100% neutral. Uh, so it is a renewable source of energy and it is much better. But if you compare it with coal, the emissions are not that far apart during the burning part of it. However, it's easily available and we see a huge supply chain developing for it because it's particularly similar for textiles as is cotton, right? So it's the same value chain that applies to it. A lot of industries are using cotton stacks as well as part of biomass. You'll see the same farmers, the same people, but there are challenges to it right now. So it's from transportation challenges to the baling challenges to the fact that biomass quality will always differ with different yields, with different crop, to the fact that if there are multiple fuels being used, they are inefficient fuels at the end of the day. And not only just the value chain of procuring, but we then also see a challenge with the ash disposal of it. And that generates another value chain for it. Now, particularly for textiles, one of the biggest things that we'll have to see is how efficient the burning technologies are now procured, and that has to be regulated. Other than that, if you go towards Karachi, the textiles are mostly areas where there's not a lot of land space. So on-site storage of these biomass fuels would be a huge challenge to see how we do that close by. Are we going to be procuring more space for this? Are we procuring lease lands for this? How are we going to be setting this up? So it's a value chain that is now under development. And the good thing about it is that it's been there for some time for other purposes. So now to adapt it for textile sector, the biggest challenge would be to see how well we can find partners who can do this for us, because textiles in itself cannot delve into this. So if you see that companies who can outsource this, the people who are now coming in on this. But yes, the biggest challenge we see in value chain development right now would be procurement to transportation to baling to unbaling of it to storage of it to the efficient burning technologies for it. And then in the end, we would want clarity from SDPI and other standards on, if we are taking 100% of it as carbon neutral, or are we taking bad emissions still as part of it?
Yeah, thank you for sharing that, especially with the context of Pakistan. And yes, these are some of the challenges that we are also considering while we go ahead with launching of the BioVentures project. So these feedback, I must say, come in at a very good time so that we can incorporate it right at the stage where we're ending the feasibility stage. So thank you for sharing that. For a global context, Trina, I'll move to you. My question to you would be, with the current global conversation challenging the sustainability of biomass, and with your team's dedicated work in formulating guidelines for its sustainable utilization, could you provide insights into your perspective on the in light of this global discourse? Specifically, I would want your perspective on how you perceive this discourse and sharing your approach to addressing the prevalent criticisms regarding biomass use. Additionally, to top it off, I will also request if you could share some of the insights that you had during discussions with other participants during COP28. So that would be a special add-on. Over to you.
Thank you, Usman, and thank you for the invitation to speak today. Excuse me. Biomass is an increasingly important topic and maybe not as well-informed topic as other parts of the path to net zero. So to be clear, the goal is net zero carbon emissions. And so biomass, as Mustafa alluded to, does not achieve that. So this is an interim solution. The way the Institute for Sustainable Communities works is we're very locally led. All of our programs, we have staff on the ground in the regions that we work. And so we were working with apparel, with the textile and footwear industries in Cambodia India, Vietnam, and Thailand. And we worked in about 100 factories, all of which want to decarbonize for all the reasons that have been laid out by the previous panelists, because all of these countries want to be a preferred supplier as well, and also they have their own national targets. So in working with the factory owners, being on the ground, and we did stakeholder consultations, about 100 people, different stakeholders, so the factory owners, the workers, industry associations, government stakeholders attended, and a big need was sustainable biomass. What does that mean? Because the boilers were already using biomass, so they've been using it. However, cutting old growth forests and things like that. So not all biomass is equal. So when you hear biomass, can be a very charged term. Not all biomass is equal. It can be very, very differentiated. So we took a year-long process to define what sustainable biomass is. We looked at 5 different categories to do that in terms of climate change, GHG emissions, conservation and natural resources, which I just alluded to. We don't want to cut old growth trees for fuel. Air quality, because the burning of biomass, not only as to be part of the fuel, but in the combustion process, emits a lot of air pollutants. Human rights and labor practices. I mean, I should mention that ISC is a very, we accelerate equitable climate change solutions. And so we're very human-centered in our climate change solutions. And so we're looking at human rights and labor practices, and also social development and food security, because we also don't want to be using food sources for boilers for thermal energy. So looking at all those factors, the farm workers' rights, indigenous rights, where the biomass is coming from rights that are protected by indigenous people. So very, very thorough categorization with many, many indicators to say what is sustainable biomass, or how sustainable is a biomass that's being procured, with full transparency for the local communities, the factory owners, the brands that are, mostly the ones that we work with are from the US and Europe. So, it's fully transparent along the supply chain. There is an interface in order for anybody to be able to ascertain the sustainability of biomass. It's a spreadsheet, it's user-friendly, but it goes through all these indicators to make that analysis. So this work was born out of Southeast Asia. However, the intention was always global applicability. So because, the brands that we worked with, they have supply chains all throughout the world, all throughout Asia, all throughout Africa, Central America. So it's meant to have global applicability. The conclusion of the report, so biomass, like I said, not all biomass is equal. It starts out with 5 categories, and the conclusion is a set of categories deemed acceptable, acceptable with mitigation plans, and completely unacceptable. So for instance, all solid wood would be in that unacceptable category. So again, just to reiterate, this is not the end solution. This is while there is more access to renewable thermal energy. So whether it's leapfrogging, having to switch boilers to electric boilers, assuming that the grid has renewable energy, or other technologies that do, decarbonize renewable or thermal energy. So what is renewable thermal energy? This is the interim that is practical and pragmatic. So there is some NGO backlash. To be clear, we are an environmental organization. We are a human-centered environmental organization, but we are on the ground working with the factories, the workers, the indigenous communities, the industry associations, and government officials as well. So there is some NGO backlash to biomass. So just that word, biomass, without the on-ground practical application. I'm in communication with all of them. There was a lot of NGO activity in the lead up to COP. Unbeknownst to ourselves, we were co-panelists at COP. And so it got quite lively, but a lot of mutual respect, because we all have the same goal, which is decarbonization. So it was a very rich discussion. mostly off the panel because we didn't want the panel to be solely about biomass. It was about sustainability in the supply chain of the fashion industry. So we didn't want the subject of biomass to take up all of the space, and because there's many important subjects to talk about, like fair wages and things like that. But offline, over a couple of coffees, we really, got to understand each other's nuances. And so positions still stand, but it's good that we're in a healthy dialogue because we do have same mutual goals of decarbonization. Usman, did I address all of your questions? Did I leave anything
Yes,
out?
thank you. Thank you for this insight.
Yeah.
And very rightly put, given that the industry is going to go for some of the modification to its plant and machinery as well, and consistency and continuous supply of biomass is one of the major concerns for industry shifting to biomass. So obviously, they are looking for a sustainable biomass supply and would want to, although it is being termed as an interim solution, but given that the whole shift to the renewable energy is not possible in a very short time. So this is a key interim solution in reducing the scope 1 emissions. Building on your previous experience and also on your exposure with other parties during the COP28 event, what do you think, what lessons can Pakistan draw from successful initiatives that you have seen elsewhere? So, what are some of the innovative technologies or approaches that Pakistan can explore for utilizing biomass in its textile sector here in Pakistan? Some of the challenges, some of the roadblocks that may have been come across by industries in other places of the world. What are some of the key things that you think Pakistani business community should be aware of and cognizant of when they are making this transition?
Is this to me?
Yeah.
Question. Okay. So one thing, we're the Institute for Sustainable Communities, so we're very locally led. And this is how we came up with, the need for a sustainable biomass guideline. One thing I would say when it comes to procuring biomass is, for instance, our the website or the guidelines and the risk assessment tool, that spreadsheet I mentioned, is not publicly available yet. It's still being finalized, but should be within the next few weeks. So that will be a good tool. It's something that we're going to be accelerating trainings of in order for implementation. But one thing is that the solutions and the procurement of biomass, it's very local. I mean, this is why I mentioned, our organization, we're a very locally led solution. Mustafa alluded to all the transportation emissions. There's a lot of, in the value chain of procuring biomass. So it's local. I mean, Pakistan has very diverse regions. There's different sources of biomass. So where are the factories and where is the biomass? And so that mapping, not just geographically, but also, there is the technical component of the thermal energy of the biomass that's being burnt. So is it matching the energy needs of that process, of whatever, if it's a shirt being made or a shoe? So there's some technical also parameters there as well of the heat capacity. But I would say it's that localization. So it's great that PET is doing this feasibility study of, and I think it includes what are the biomass availabilities, the types of biomass, but I would also add the location of the biomass procurement. And also there's local laws, there's compliance, as I said, there's some community rights or, there's some, sensitivities there with local communities in some regions that definitely need to be incorporated as well. There's opportunities because then maybe farmers can be compensated for the agricultural waste, for instance, that's being used as biomass. I mean, to be paid fairly for that, I think is very important. Looking at the health and safety of what was agricultural waste or leftover fuel, like waste fuel from restaurant uses, for instance, in using that in biomass, and looking at the health and safety aspects as well. But that local view, I think, is very important. I mean, that's how we work. So, I mean, I'm saying that from the perspective of ISC, but just also in general biomass, because it's what biomass is, as I said, it's not all the same. It's there's animal manure, there's sawmill dust from manufacturing sites. I mean, there's a whole value chain in the biomass ecosystem. And so really that mapping, I think, is important from a technical point of view, a place-based point of view, a human-centered point of view, and what is the least air polluting or GHG, emitting GHG, things like that, which is all in the risk assessment tool.
Thanks for bringing that up. You rightly put it, local perspective is equally important, and given that there are different stakeholders involved on the ground, so unless and until each stakeholder's requirements are adequately addressed, it won't be possible to secure a complete buy-in for a successful biomass integration into the textile and apparel sector. Thank you for sharing that insight. Mustafa, back to you. Regarding the context of Pakistan's textile and apparel industry. What challenges do you think the current textile industry is facing right now in going forward with the implementation? And also, what can customers do? What role they can play in demanding a shift towards this biomass energy for integration into the textile and apparel chains, textile and apparels uh, chain?
I think Trina made it very, I think, rightly pointed out that the biggest challenges right now for us are the fact that how we convert from the existing to renewable technology, but at the same moment, it has to make a cost, economic sense to it as well. And that is why you'll see this shift happening because of this recent changes in the fuel and energy prices in Pakistan. This shift then became suddenly very economical. However, now you have to remember that we are a agricultural country, and this crop that we're now trying to burn as biomass, and mostly we're not going to go with the sawdust and wood part of it because that I agree, the FSC certifications required for it and all of those become really important for their traceability. But for agricultural waste that we're burning, this is also fodder crop, and this is where
Yes.
we also need to look into that what we're going to be doing as more and more companies go into burning these. Uh, Very rightly pointed out by Trina, this cannot be done for more than 100 kilometer of distance, or an effective would be a 50-kilometer radius from the company because the traveling cost and then the transportation cost then again become uneconomical. The storage costs then become uneconomical. There are challenges to the fact of moisture and the quality. Every time the quality check, these are inefficient fuels, and they vary with their calorific values to their quality of sand and silt every crop yield with every crop yield. However, one of the funny things is that Pakistan is still at a policy level much further apart than other countries. Like, for example, you'll see a lot of companies who have converted their existing boilers into biomass, but I don't see a dispersion modeling done for their stack emissions or for their stack. It's the same stack, and you do know that biomass emissions generate more particulate matters. They have more issues with their emissions. They're really close by to coal emissions. So that is something that we need as a policy or at a regulatory level, and that requires an investment. That requires a huge investment, and that is where the customers come in. Now, US Group was lucky enough to find a customer like H&M who did its first sponsored biomass boiler for us. So they were the ones who contributed to setting it up for them, and it's a good initiative because it helps them directly in their scope 3 emissions. And that is where we then cash on or bank on it, that yes, this will generate a lot of things. But again, a huge problem is the fact that we have to have a huge storage space for biomass as well. And that for existing textile companies, especially the ones in Karachi, it's a very difficult project to do. One of the things also that I would maybe Trina can share something on that is the fact that when it comes to traceability, now you're dealing with a hugely informal sector when it comes to farmers. So there is going to be no sector-based studies there, and there's going to be no, traceability to an extent because they're small farmers who then give it to a middleman or to a big farmer, and then the biomass is sold back. At the same moment, you can't have FSC, of course, on the agricultural waste at the moment because that would just not be feasible at this stage. So this is something that we've delved into without any formal sort of a regulatory compliance from the government or sets compliance. Now, even the fact that how we calculate the emissions for it is still controversial to when it comes to CDP or SBTI or other standards, when some take it as completely carbon neutral, some have a certain percentage of it as still GHGs that need to be counted in. Some, of course, try and report it separately at the moment, and they're still figuring out if this has to be taken as carbon neutral or not. So the challenges, of course, are there, but they have sort of magnified because of the fact that now you're going to be dealing with extremely informal sectors. And that is where the existing textiles existing setups, existing infrastructures are trying to take in this change. And this, in essence, of course, requires a proper, built up to it, a proper storage systems. Simply, fire safety measures have to be taken very well now, because it's a huge fire load that's going to be put on site. And with moistures and with rainfalls, this just exponentially increases. So these are some grassroots problems that industries have dwelled into without figuring out before. And this is, I think, where those risk assessments or those things have to come in and sort of guide them through.
Yeah, thank you for bringing that up. I think it is this very reason, this informal supply chain that motivated and was the ground setting for PET to take this bioventures project forward. And as you said, there is, considering the context of Pakistan as a developing country and new to this concept, there is a lot to be done on the policy front as well. And it is good to see that global brands are now not only extending technical capability and technical capacity, but also financial assistance in moving towards this uh, a cleaner source of energy, replacing the fossil fuels, because it not only reduces and attends to the scope 1 emissions of the textile manufacturers, but also covers their scope 3 emissions as well. So it is a good collaboration, and replicating it across the industry, I think that the benefits would be huge in a very short time, and well before the implementation of the regulations on the EU front and globally for the textile and apparel manufacturers in Pakistan. Thank you for your time and for your insights. I think these were valuable for the audience as well as for the team that is working on the bioventures project here at PET. Over to you, Swa.
Thank you so much, Usman, Mustafa, and especially Trina for joining us despite the time zone difference. We know that Pakistani businesses are particularly interested in biomass. But moving on, the first step for businesses to decarbonize and set on a net zero path is to calculate their emissions and then set science-based targets. And we know that this comes with its own set of challenges. And for that, we're going to delve deep into this in our next panel, which is going to be moderated by Suman Al-Haq, Program Associate at Pakistan Environment Trust. Suman, over to you.
Thank you, Swa. Okay. Can you also please spotlight Ehtesham? Okay, there we go. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining us today, for your time and for your energy. So ever since Net Zero Pakistan coalition came into existence, we got all of our member companies to commit to science-based targets. And for the entire 2-year period since then, we've been very proactively assisting all of our member companies to make sure that their organizational goals and emission targets align with SDPIs, but also in building their capacities to measure their own GHG footprints and align their emission footprints accordingly. So as part of that service provision that we as a coalition do, we partnered with MyCarbon. MyCarbon is a sustainability consulting firm based out of the UK. And they're primarily working with some of our member companies and calculating their scope 1, 2, 3 emissions inventories, and then also helping them submit their SDPI targets. So the largest challenge that we faced, especially in Pakistan's textile sector and those companies that are committed to SDPI, is the scope 3 emissions calculations, which are basically the indirect emissions from upstream and downstream supply chains. So I will be using this panel to just dive a little bit deeper into some of these problems and some of the service provision that we have been doing through MyCarbon. And I'm joined by 2 incredible professionals who are working in this sector. I'm joined by Scott Christy, who is MyCarbon's lead consultant. He's based out of the UK. He's working on validating emission reduction targets for our companies, and he has worked with some of the UK's largest companies on developing their science-based targets and helping them get the targets approved. Ehtesham is, we are also joined by Ehtesham Ali, who is the General Manager for Compliance at Liberty Mills. He has more than 20 years of experience in the textile sector, most particularly in leading the areas of safety, quality, and management systems, and compliance and environmental sustainability. Thank you so much, Scott and Ehtesham, for joining us today. My first question is to you, Scott. So over the past 6 months, you have been working very closely with some of our member companies. So throughout this journey, how has your experience been like working with the Pakistani companies in doing their scope 1, 2, 3 emissions, and also doing their SBTI targets? And I would like you to answer this mostly in the context of how you've worked with other companies around the world. How do you see the progress that already been being made by these companies? How do you see their corporate structures driving those emissions, and how do you see them actually reaching those targets?
Of course, yes. Thank you for the very kind introduction, Saman, and thank you everyone for attending today and inviting me to be part of the process. I think on the whole, we've been really very impressed with our work so far with the member companies as part of the Net Zero Pakistan consortium. I think on the whole, these companies have been ahead of the curve in what we've tend to see from some of the other companies we work with. At MyCarbon, we work with a range of companies, some of those who are just starting out on their sustainability journey and don't know the difference between emission scopes or that scopes even exist, all the way up from the companies who are very, very detailed and understand a lot about the process, the requirements, things like the GHG protocol and the Science Based Targets Initiative. So I would firmly put the member companies we've worked with so far at the top end of that. There's a great level of understanding across the board. A lot of the work has already been conducted internally, particularly around scope 1 and 2. Those emissions have been calculated and reported on already in good detail by a lot of the companies. In most cases, we haven't actually been recalculating these emissions. We've just been sort of verifying that the calculations that have been done so far are correct. And on the whole, everything has been correct, and we've been very impressed with what we've seen there so far. And even coming to scope 3, there's a good level of understanding about the information required. The access, the availability of the information is very good, and the understanding of sort of, I guess, the upstream, the downstream, what's applicable to individual companies, where their key emission sources sit. Obviously, things like flag as well, which are very important in the textile industries. There's been a really good level of understanding. So it's been a relatively straightforward process, really, because all of the kind of cooperation, all the information, everything has been provided well on time. And it's been a pleasure really to work with the companies, like you said, for the last 6 months, and hopefully that relationship will continue on for much longer in the future. I think that the science-based targets element of it, many of the companies that's maybe where it's a little bit more new to the companies in the consortium, but I think that's the same across everybody around the world. Really, it's a very new process. There aren't many companies who've been doing science-based targets for more than 2 or 3 years, maybe anyway. So there's a lot to be understood out there, and the SBTI is constantly updating its guidance and its guidelines to be able to sort of further help companies out. So that's where we come in, really, as experts in the science-based targets requirements and everything to do with those people.
Yes, so just building on that, so you've worked with about 4 companies now, and you've done their scope 1, 2, 3 emissions. Can you just talk a little about what their emissions profile looks like across scope 1, 2, and 3, and then dive just a little bit deeper about what their scope 3 profile looks like? Where are the emissions coming from?
Yeah, of course. So I think the SBTI have actually published some figures recently that on the whole, scope 3 tends to be around 11, 12 times more than scope 1 and 2 emissions, typically for companies. With the companies we're working through with Net Zero Pakistan, this is probably less. It's probably more like only 3 or 4 times higher scope 3 emissions. So I think that there's a lot of processing requirements for the textiles industries, natural gas consumption or biomass in the scope 1, for sort of heating processes, generating steam on site, or then purchasing electricity or other energy forms from outside sources. across the company so far, it tends to be around 25 to 30% of the total emissions are from Scope 1 and 2 sources, which from a decarbonisation point of view is quite a good thing, because those emission sources you have some control over as a company. You can do things to resolve that, whether that's by improving energy efficiency measures, so you reduce your consumption, which saves you money but also saves your emissions, or you can look to alternatives for, say, natural gas as to biogas alternative or biomass alternative, which I heard the last bit of the last discussion. I know there are some issues around biomass, and there's never one perfect solution, but in terms of absolute emissions over the life cycle, biomass is definitely a better option than coal or natural gas or any sort of fossil fuel alternative. And very similarly to with purchased electricity in Scope 2, there's the option to seek renewable alternatives, or I know a lot of the companies have got some on-site generation for their renewable electricity with sort of large-scale solar installations. So those emissions are high as sort of overall proportion, but there's a lot to do with them. And then moving into Scope 3, the main source of emissions really are within the purchased raw materials, so the cotton and the materials used for the manufacturing of goods, and then the outward distribution. Obviously, clothing that's being manufactured in Pakistan is being transported all around the world, so there's emissions associated and generated there. But a lot of it we've seen so far tends to be via sea freight out to some of the ports. Obviously, Pakistan has a large coastal area, so there's the option to send things via sea freight, which is much lower in emissions than something like air freight, which is really good to see already. So those are the two main sources of Scope 3 emissions, which make up sort of 60 to 65% of the total footprint.
Thank you, Scott. That's a very comprehensive breakdown. So moving to you, Ehtesham. So your company committed to the SDPIs 2 years ago, and you're almost at the finish line of submitting the targets, which is just the step one. So I have two questions for you. So A, what was the primary motivation in joining the Net Zero Coalition and then coming on to the science-based targets? And B, what are some of the major challenges that you have faced in the past 2 years from commitment to target submission?
Thank you, Osman. The first question regarding about the emission. First of all, it was all definitely we are committed towards the sustainable programs. We are working with different retailers in US and Europe. So we are working, although lot of programs with different customers like Walmart and H&M and all those players. So that's promote us to definitely sign the SDPIs. We have some targets because we are working as a Scope 3 supplier for them. So first of all, this is the main challenge. Secondly, the net zero, I think, is the platform which definitely promote a lot of things and give awareness to the Pakistani textile suppliers as well to sign the SDPIs and promote their studies in this regard. Secondly, what are the challenges we are facing? Initially, it was tough to understand the requirements of SDPI when we signed the SDPI documents in 2021. The material has a lot of other links, especially the SDPI, which cause a lot of confusion when we are talking about learning about something. On the other hand, expertise was not available, and people had their understanding of SDPI of their own. Although industries are working with the HIG index and brand sustainability programs like Gigaton by Walmart, H&M and IKEA have their own programs, industries have some understanding about Scope 1, Scope 2 emissions, while there's a lot of confusion about the Scope 3 emissions, especially the calculations, the upstream and downstream understanding. Secondly, the setting of the boundaries and understanding of the Scope 3 15 categories, which category apply to us and what categories not apply to us. That's a big challenge we are facing that time. The third thing is the flag emission is still a question mark for many of the industries. They are struggling for that. So many industries are struggling with calculation emissions, especially for the Scope 3. There are a lot of confusions, especially the calculation have double, you can categorize in Scope 1 as well as Scope 2. So there's a chance of double calculation of it. So there are a lot of misunderstanding about that. I think Net Zero Pakistan has played a vital role in giving an understanding of SDPI's calculation of emissions through expert sessions and sharing of industry good practices which helps a lot for industries. Still, there are a lot of while submitting short-term and long-term targets. The first thing is to calculate the accurate emissions, and then we will be able to set our short-term and long-term targets. So we are facing of submitting our targets, and we have working with the MyCarbon team. And it's a very good, have good expertise on that thing. They have supported us a lot, and we have submitting all our data to them. They are calculating and guide us. Their guidance are very important for us to calculate the scope 3 emissions as well. So I think Scott has directly involved in all these question and answers sessions we have directly with them. And the first thing I really appreciate is they timely intimate all the information to us. So I think all the industries are facing the same challenges, especially the scope 3 calculations.
Thank you, Ehtesham. Are you done?
Yes, evidence.
Okay, thank you, Ehtesham. I agree with you that like initially when you all joined the coalition and signed up, there wasn't really a lot of knowledge in the industry and sector to just know what this is all about and what everybody is really signing up for. But over the years, we have tried to really build that knowledge pool within NCP members over repeated town halls and sessions, and I think the results are a testament to all of that. When Scott says that the companies that he's seeing in Pakistan, they already have a really good understanding of upstream and downstream emissions and scope 3 emissions. That really needs it really makes us feel really good about the work that we've been doing for the past 2 years. So moving on to you, Scott, again, can you just walk us through some of the major takeaways from the COP28, which just finished yesterday, but and what those takeaways mean for industrial decarbonization and manufacturers, especially in developing countries like Pakistan?
Yeah, I think it's the COP is always an interesting time, particularly in sustainability. Everyone will be aware. There's so much news going on. There's so many different talks being held. There's so much happening. I think it will take a few weeks and maybe months to digest everything and for the real sort of highlights and the important things to come out. I know, for example, that decarbonisation of the built environment, so office buildings, home buildings, there was a dedicated forum and a couple of days to that at COP this year, which is the first time that's ever happened. And we know a number of people that presented as part of that and how to sort of improve the decarbonisation effort in the construction sectors and in the sort of already built environment. So the fact that COP is evolving and constantly sort of welcoming new ideas is always great to see. I think the main takeaway that sort of only really got finalised yesterday for me was the transition, the phasing out, the whichever the term is that was decided on away from the fossil fuels industry. And I think given the geography and some of the issues that had come around some of the delegates and the president of COP also being the president of an oil and gas company, there was a lot of hesitancy and maybe concern, particularly, personally, that oil and gas wasn't going to be targeted heavily enough, or that it would be avoided or not spoken on. So to have an agreement in place or to have some wording in place that says that oil and gas will be reduced, I think on oil and gas and in line with that 2050 net zero requirement is really important. We will wait and see what happens. But as always is the case, these things get said and these things get written, but what the actual, outcome will be and how that will look going forwards over the next couple of years and the changes is yet to be seen. But I'm optimistic that the actions regarding oil and gas will have a positive impact. I think specifically on SBTI as well. I think the SBTI had a strong presence at COP again, as they often have done for the past few years. So their key thing, and it sort of links back to scope 3 emissions, and I think particularly important for you companies here in Pakistan. Ehtesham, you mentioned that you are the scope 3 emissions of your suppliers. The companies that you're working with, you form their scope 3 emissions. So they are going through that supply chain process of understanding what their supply chain is doing, and that's where I think the consortium and the great work you've done so far, Saman, in organising everyone and having everything put together, building that knowledge together and having companies who are working together on a common goal, but also puts you ahead of the curve in terms of other suppliers around the world. And it could put you a good advantage in a business sense too. kind of further those relationships with your suppliers if you've already done a lot of the things they're asking for on sustainability, if you've committed to science-based targets, if you're going to provide your emissions profile. These are all things that a lot of companies around the world won't be able to do or might not even be willing to do. So showing that ambition is really important and aligns a lot with all the things the SDPI have been saying recently, that supply chain engagement is really going to be the key in the short term to sort of spreading the message of sustainability, if you will, and seeing a long-term impact from that.
Yeah, thanks, Scott. Over to you, Ehtesham. I just have one major question from you, Ehtesham, and I'm very curious to hear what you have to say on this. So when it comes to actually achieving the targets that you are going to be setting with the SDPI, what are some major interventions and changes you see happening in the textile sector at large in Pakistan to really meet those targets? Some major interventions that you can really foresee happening. And you are muted, Ehtesham.
As I mentioned earlier, that the understanding of GHG calculation is a base issue. On the other hand, scope 3 calculation and especially the data collection from the supplier, especially in a big task. When we talk about the collecting data from fields, farms, ginning, spinning, and weaving, if you do not have a vertical setup, it's a big challenge for us to the correct data for our emissions calculations. Most of the suppliers do not have an understanding of how to collect data, especially their awareness are very weak. And when you go to calculate that, if you do not calculate the correct emissions, definitely it's a challenge for you to accurately set your targets. So it's extremely necessary that from the next phase, we engage ginning, spinning, and weaving suppliers in the net zero platform for the smooth and accurate emission data collection in this sector. This is my suggestion for the next year. Secondly, definitely, we are in Karachi, especially we are talking about the textile sector. They are facing a big challenge of the biomass availability because we are a lack of space, in Karachi is very difficult. Secondly, the availability of biomass is a big challenge for us as compared to Punjab facilities. So we are struggling for that, even though 1 hour of facility, you can know the Suti has stored the biomass of 15 megaton. So we are also working with 25 megaton biomass and up to the June, I think we will be in the implementing phase and will be in the operation. But the big challenge is the availability of biomass and the cost. Because the availability of the agricultural waste is not available in Karachi nearby. So we have facing a transport cost in terms of availability. So this is a big challenge for decarbonization of our emissions. Secondly, the REC is a problem. I think it's a big thing we have facing right now because in the scope 2, definitely we are having electricity from K Electric. So we do not know the source. So definitely we need RECs to decarbonize our emissions in that category. So this is from one side. Definitely the main thing which we are facing, all the textile sectors, is the collection of data from our suppliers. The suppliers do not have their understanding, especially Usman, this also mentioned, that if at the farmer levels, they do not have an understanding. The small suppliers did not have understanding where they come from. And the first thing, there's a traceability of that particular thing is very big challenge for all the suppliers for their audits, definitely. So I think this is from my side. Still, the textiles are still struggling for having good thing. And you know that as per the current increase in the gas price by the government, all the textile sector are moving to the biomass, and the availability of biomass is a big challenge. So I think we have to do it as per our cost vector. As you know, the per meter cost is very high, getting high day by day. So all the textile sector are aggressively working on it to reduce the cost and the availability of the raw material as well.
Thank you, Ehtesham. You summed up all of this really well. So just to go over your points, you've mentioned data collection from your suppliers a couple of times. And I want to reiterate that we at Net Zero Pakistan, we've recently developed a really effective and simple data collection tool for supplier engagement. And we will be doing some more campaigns starting from next year to really make sure that all of our members use that tool to map their supply chain. So you should look out for that. This is also for other members who have joined us and were not aware of this. But you mentioned that you take good electricity from K Electric, and and of course that's you don't have any choice. But have you been like as somebody from the textile sector, have you been looking for the CTBCM mechanism, like really waiting for that power market shift that's been promised to us for the past 4 to 5 years? Do you see that as a way to solve some of these issues with grid to emissions?
Definitely, we are working on it, and definitely we aggressively working to decarbonize our system as well as our processes. And REC is, I think, the best way when we purchase it and decarbonize our all the emissions, because due to lack of space, all the roofs of our supply chains are covered with these solar panels. So we do not have enough space to install further solar panels. Yes, we have started our spinning sector in Uriabad. We are going to install 9 megawatt of a wind turbine in that facility. 4.5 megawatt of each. 2 turbines will be installed within 2 months. And that could be a good thing for us to definitely for processing and weaving side. We decarbonize our processes up to 9 megawatt per hour. So that could be the only we can do. Otherwise, the Karachi, all the facilities are working aggressively on the solar side, but they do not have enough space for that. So all the roofs are covered. We cannot install even wind turbine in our facilities. Although all the facility will have it in Uriabad, the Jhampi side they can install. But definitely in Jhampi, we cannot claim it because it's directly go into the national network. So we have a facility in Nuriabad, so we directly intake that input in our facility for 9 megawatt. So I think these are the big challenges we are facing right now in our textile sectors. And moving forwards, all the retailers are also working with us for different projects in terms of energy audits, in terms of savings, in terms of energy savings activities for steam saving or different design implementation are there for steam leakages and all the process, and especially for the machines have less energy use. I think these are all these steps we can take to decarbonize our processes as well, to change our machineries as well, change our processes, and especially the energy audit will be a good part to analyze where we are the weaknesses, where are the lacknesses, and we have to overcome all these things.
Yes. Thank you so much, Ehtesham. We're almost at time here. Thank you, Scott. Thank you, Ehtesham. Thank you so much for joining this panel and for this insightful conversation. We don't have any questions in the chat, but if anybody has any questions, please write them in the chat and we will try to answer as much as possible. Thank you again.
Thank you.
Thank you, Saman, Ehtesham, and Scott for this conversation. I'm sure it was particularly insightful for businesses who are looking to set science-based targets. And this also brings us to our third and much-awaited panel, which is going to explore the significance of renewable energy certificates in Pakistan's energy landscape. And for this panel, I would like to call upon our program director, Hassan Anwar. Hassan, over to you.
Thanks, Oswa. Thank you so much. And a very warm welcome to our esteemed guest, Jos Tuinenberg from the ARIC Foundation and Dr. Vaqar from SDPI. But before I go into sort of introductions, I think the last question is a particularly sort of important segue into the discussion we're having. I mean, we've seen how interest in IREX particularly has grown over the past year. It's become a bit of a buzzword both within the sustainability space as well as within the renewable energy space in the country. So just for context, for some of our audiences, renewable energy certificates at the very core are essentially tradable instruments equivalent to 1 megawatt hour of renewable energy that can be traded from renewable energy producers to entities that can use them to fulfill their corporate reporting commitments. That includes, science-based targets. And PET, as its national issuer for renewable energy certificates, as the entity that's regulating the market in Pakistan, has helped really catalyze the market. And evidence of that, of the growing interest, is the fact that at the start of this year, we had around 5 megawatts of projects that were registered for renewable energy certificates. By the end of this year, as we approach the end of this year, this number has grown to 700 megawatts. The number of certificates that have been issued over the past year have grown by almost 400%. And we see that this number rising significantly. In the next quarter, we foresee that this market would have generated, a trading volume that's equivalent to generating value of more than $1.5 million. So those are very significant numbers. And to make sense of these numbers, make sense of this market itself, I don't think we can have a better, guest list or a better panelist list. First, alongside me is Jos Tuinenberg, who represents the IREC Foundation, the governance body behind the IREC standard, but also someone who's literally written the book on renewable energy certificates and has set the methodologies and standards that are governing the market right now. Jos has been working with governments, with market players, and other stakeholders to really build robust tracking systems, including for energy, but other areas as well, that are helping businesses across the globe with their scope to reporting commitments. And on the other side, we have Dr. Vaqar Ahmed from the Sustainable Development Policy Institute, which is Pakistan's preeminent policy research think tank, and a think tank that has been at the forefront of research in Pakistan, both on climate finance, as well as creating a more enabling landscape for renewable energy. So Dr. Vaqar has previously worked and served with the Asian Development Bank, UNDP, the World Bank, as well as working with the Ministries of Planning, Finance, and Commerce in Pakistan. So a very warm welcome to you both, and it is our honor to sort of have you here. So, without any further ado, I want to start this panel, and I want to sort of start with you, Jos. So you've seen firsthand the growth that has occurred in the market, in the REC market in Pakistan. I want you to sort of having seen similar markets grow in other countries, including Turkey, as well as others. I want you to juxtapose the progress that we've seen in Pakistan against other markets that have seen similar market setup, as well as also providing a bit of context on the future for this market in Pakistan, given the experience of other countries. So yeah, Jos, over to you.
Yes, thank you, Hassan, for also first of all inviting me here and having this well-organized webinar. I've been listening in for some other sessions as well. And just a few sentences background. So the IREC Standard Foundation is a non-profit international global standard for attribute tracking systems, most known for electricity tracking around the world. We're currently active in about 60 countries around the world outside of the EU and the US. And the global market for IREC, so the total issuance of IRECs in all IREC markets combined, will this year probably be towards 300 terawatt hours, which is about 30% of the European market and about 50% of the US market. The IREC markets are relatively new, so we're growing at a much faster rate. The European and US market has been in existence since the early 2000s. IREC markets has really started growing in 2015, 16, 17. So we have been growing number-wise into like 70 to 120% year over year for the last 5 years. And I think the introduction of IREC in Pakistan with PET as issuer has been going on very well so far. And just we are a global standard, but we focus on local implementation of the system. So having PET and having a Ministry of Energy or a grid operator or an other nonprofit, we work with all types of organizations. And we see in terms of the volumes that having such a local entity is extremely important. So in Pakistan, there's already, I think, vintage 2023, it was around 90,000 this year, but the actual requests for the numbers or the total requests in this year include some vintage of 2022. Pakistan is already at 150,000 IREX this year at their first full year. And to put it in perspective, as you mentioned, Hassan, for Turkey, it's a little bit of an unfair comparison because Turkey was one of the first countries that was in the establishment of the market, but they were at around 100,000 for like several years. Until 2018, when it really started to grow, especially as we had a local issuer since 2019, 2020. And I've got the numbers right here. So Turkey went from 150,000 in 2018 to 550,000 to 900,000, and then from 900,000 to 9 million in 1 year, a 10-time increase of the markets. And put Pakistan in perspective with some other countries, very similar. Argentina was introduced a few years ago, went from 107,000 in the first year to 800,000 in the second year. Kazakhstan started at 90,000, went to 170. So there are many examples, and it looks looking very well organized in this first year.
Thanks, Jos. Thank you so much. And I think what these numbers really represent is also the value that they are generating for renewable energy producers, right? The premium that renewable energy producers need to get, because each certificate is underlinked to transfer of funds as well to renewable energy producers. So that is a very important point for the renewable energy market in Pakistan, especially in terms of catalyzing it. But what I want to sort of go to Dr. Vaqar here, and Dr. Vaqar, one of the primary reasons why this market has really grown is the fact that, as we've seen in the previous panel as well, that there is very significant appetite for renewable energy in Pakistan. And the growth in IREX demonstrates that companies and entities do want to transition towards renewable energy. But one of the barriers that they have faced so far are more on the regulatory and policy side, and CDBCM is one of them, is that can help them. But I want to turn to you, and from your vantage point as one of the organizations that is the forefront of this policy change, what are some of the roadblocks that that both producers as well as companies are currently facing in terms of transitioning to renewable energy? And how do you think, what role can REX play in catalyzing this particular transition?
Yes, thank you for having me. I'll take lead from what Jos was trying to explain to us, and really group the challenges here in maybe just 4 headings. One, I think the private sector is greatly facing difficulty of navigating the regulatory space. This is not new. Of course, such an environment has been around. But given that a lot is at stake now, I think the urgency has to be advocated. And if I can sort of break down the first sort of element, which is uncertainty at a policy and regulatory level, I mean, oftentimes private sector firms would really struggle to see incentives for themselves within the overall renewable energy framework at a federal or provincial level. Of course, when one talks about the provinces, there are some inconsistencies in the regulatory environment, given that after the 18th Amendment, the bureaucratic procedures differ widely across provinces, which also means that anybody trying to invest in this space, in the RE space, is confronted with essentially 5 different regulatory regimes. Something which we are now told that PRMI, Pakistan Regulatory Modernization Initiative, is trying to address. And within this, I think the third subpart is the limited access to financing for transitioning towards renewable energy projects, given that there are high initial and sunk costs involved. Again, given that examples are only coming up thanks to players such as yourself, but a lot more has to be done in terms of the understanding of the commercial sector, the banking sector, the financial sector regulator, which is the central bank, in terms of ensuring seamless financing for RE transition. The other set of constraints, the second set of constraints which the private sector faces, is with regards to the grid infrastructure, and the fact that insufficient grid capacity and weak transmission, of course, hinders the integration of large-scale RE projects. We also see that a lack of smart grid technologies and energy storage solutions to manage variability in renewable energy generation has been a deterrent as well. I would also like to touch upon a third element, which is institutional weakness, somehow overlaps with the first one. But that is largely because maybe some of the provinces are not at the same level of understanding as others may be. And this is where the role of federal government comes in terms of policy coordination, in terms of capacity building, which can sort of bridge the gaps when it comes to institutional weaknesses at a sub-national level. We are also seeing that in the case of many of the inefficiencies of state-owned power utilities with high financial losses, while of course there have been negotiations with the provinces, there's a resistance to their reform, including handing them over to the provinces. And I think it will be a missed opportunity if one has to hand them over to provinces in the current shape, unless there are some underlying incentives for the RE transition. I could quickly touch upon, maybe as a footnote, touch upon how, for example, RECs could help address some of these roadblocks, which I have mentioned. One, of course, as I said, RECs definitely complement greater policy and regulatory certainty, and with good outreach for the private sector, RECs can demonstrate the feasibility and benefits of RE and potentially influencing the policy decisions towards a more supportive environment. REs, we have seen, and Josh has also informed us that they do provide a platform for collaboration as well, sharing between international and local stakeholders, something which is much desired for Pakistan if it has to integrate into global and regional value chains. I think one of the attraction here should be for the business associations. And given that chambers of commerce or Pakistan Business Council, they could sort of help their members envision attracting greater investment, greater finance through RECs, given that RECs can create a new revenue stream for renewable energy developers, making such projects more financially attractive. And likewise, given that Pakistan stands at a very critical juncture economy-wise, and given that we're in dire need of FDI, so here and again, RECs can attract international investment by providing a much more transparent and globally recognized mechanism for tracking and claiming environmental benefits. Thanks.
Thank you, Dr. Vaqar. Thank you so much. Those were very, very insightful comments. And I think one of the things that needs to be sort of, highlighted is the fact that renewable energy producers in Pakistan particularly do not really get a premium for producing renewable energy, right? And RECs is a way for them to get that premium, to realize that premium for that attribute of producing renewable electricity. And I think you touched upon sort of two very important points that I want to sort of go back to yours with. So I think one of the points that Dr. Vaqar pointed out is creating more transparency, particularly when it comes to local and domestic power generation, as well as creating domestic renewable portfolio standards that can further help catalyze renewable energy uptake. So Ross, what role do you see the IREC standard playing in terms of supporting domestic renewable portfolio standards, especially in context of what you've seen in other markets as well? And secondly, I also want to sort of, you to touch upon another point that Dr. Vaqar pointed out, which is, helping Pakistan and Pakistani production compete and also meet global regulatory regimes such as the incoming CBAM. So if you can sort of, speak about a bit of both on both areas, especially what you've seen in other more mature markets.
Yes, thank you, San. And some interesting points for me, of course. I focus more on the international aspect, so it's always nice to have sort of a national perspective from Dr. Vaqar today on some of the roadblocks in Pakistan. And I think RECs can definitely help, whether it's on a voluntary way already or maybe future legislative purposes. So we have to understand that almost all IRECs, so this year 300 terawatt hours in all markets, are all done on a completely voluntary basis. An IREC is nothing more than a statement of fact of when and where a specific megawatt hour of electricity has been produced, and it allocates the right to a unique end user to make a claim about that specific megawatt hour. It doesn't say anything about good or bad, it's just these are the energy sources that produce electricity and who is allowed to claim what. And having that factual instrument, there are a ton of regulatory purposes that can be attached to that. And I think, and because I was listening to into the biomass, and I think creating even additional value is possible. So a REC is worth as much as a consumer is willing to pay for it. But you can distinguish yourself as a producer saying, well, I am not only a solar or I'm not only biomass, but I'm going to work with some sustainability firms in Pakistan to create a sustainable biomass label. And I'm going to make sure I'm going to be adhering to that label. So when I'm selling my IREX from biomass, I can sell it at a higher price because I can prove that I adhere to the sustainable definition, as for example, in one of the other webinars was explained. In terms of policy possibilities using instruments such as IREC, there are really a lot of possibilities. And you touched upon CBAM. So CBAM is a still in development project for the EU that wants to tax certain goods coming into the EU against a certain emission baseline, focusing on, for now, fertilizer, hydrogen, steel, aluminium, and electricity, and I think, and cement. And the embedded emission of products will be taken into account as well. Currently, that's done by or a default value per industry or country. This is something we're very much against because it puts a country or sector within a country at an equal playing field with their with other companies in their country and also in other countries, and you cannot change the emission of the grid in a whole country by yourself. So the second option in CBAM is the reporting of actual emissions, and some of the details are still unclear, but what is clear is that the use of a power purchase agreement will be accepted as well as proof that where your electricity was coming from. We believe EACs are the only instruments that, or RECs are the only instrument that can prove that the PPA is actually coming from renewables, but there are still some question marks on the actual implementation, because what about countries where PPAs are not possible between end user and a producer, such as in Pakistan, I believe? And what about just purchasing IREX when it's not part of a 10-year deal? These are some of the points that we're pushing for in the CBAM regulatory body to make sure that IREX will be accepted when this legislation really becomes effective. Then maybe on some of the national aspects. So once you have a voluntary market that works, and with it works, I mainly mean there is liquidity in the market. Some of the big producers are registered with the system. A lot of industries are purchasing. There is a vibrant market for RECs. I think it becomes really interesting to attach policy to it. We've seen a few examples in the US. There's an RPS system per US state. Most US states have an RPS in which utilities are required to supply a certain percentage of their electricity from renewable sources. And that compliance is proved by the US REC system. This could, of course, be implemented on the utility level or end user level. It doesn't matter. It's just the overall thought of it. We've also seen an example with IREX in Malaysia, where one state utility is given as a pilot. They did a tax reductions for end users that were signing up to the green tariff, proven with the IREX. So it's a way to play with, if you're willing to pay for a green premium, maybe you adhere to a legislation, or you or get a tax deduction, or the entities that are not buying in an IREC would have to pay a higher tax because they have to claim to be using from fossil sources. And maybe as a last point, this is something that some of my colleagues talked about during COP with a few governments from mainly African countries. And we've been discussing the idea and we've been framing it as a reverse CBAM. And this may sound a little bit funny at first, but we think the idea of a CBAM is just allocating a specific tax to specific organizations that are not focusing or that are focusing on renewables. And with a reverse CBAM, we mean a country could, for example, put a tax on international companies in the country that are using the national resources of the country, and then saying, well, you're using our national resources. The least you can do is at least make sure you're purchasing renewables for your activities in our country. And by having that with IREC, a system that they're already familiar with from other countries, I think the implementation and the acceptance of companies having to do that will actually be very high. So these are just a few examples of policy possibilities, but having a very clear and strong voluntary market is the beginning. And I think this year gives good hope for this to be established very quickly in Pakistan.
Thanks, Jos. So again, as always, like very, very interesting insights. And I think we've got the right audience and the right panelists to be able to address some of these. Particularly, I think I love that idea around a reverse CBAM. Hopefully, it becomes more than just a sort of slogan. But Dr. Vaqar, coming back to you, and I think with as we see with the advent of CDBCM, which was alluded to in the previous panel as well as something that we've been talking about for years now. How do you see the REX market and the REX standard, particularly renewable attribute tracking, interplaying with CDBCM coming in? How can it potentially complement that, and how can we sort of use these two key areas to actually further enhance the uptake of renewable energy?
Yes, thank you. I think that firstly, of course, it is well established now that energy attribute tracking in competitive power markets at least holds immense potential. And of course, first reason is, of course, the same, which was transparency and fairness, which we alluded to in my earlier intervention. Second, of course, attracting greater innovation, or at least incentivizing innovation, in areas like energy storage and smart grid technologies, which are crucial for managing the variability of renewable power. But I think the third point is important, which is to really accelerate the overall RE adoption, and tracking attributes enable the creation of market-based mechanisms, like, of course, REX, which can be traded separately from the physical power, further boosting the value of RE and accelerating its adoption. Also, I think energy attributes could help you align with global trends, something which, as I was mentioning, that our own business associations need to be sensitized about, that energy attribute tracking is already gaining traction in competitive power markets worldwide. And implementing a similar system in Pakistan would really position it as a proactive player in global energy transition. Of course, this is not without challenges. One has to build a robust tracking system requiring strong policy framework, efficient infrastructure, and relevant personnel or HR who can take care of this, and addressing concerns about, of course, aspects such as data integrity are also important. But of course, we are encouraged that on these challenges, of course, we have seen government institutions like Alternate Energy Development Board come forward. Many of us have been participating in their meetings as well. So I believe that sort of by actively engaging stakeholders, learning from the international experience, and then prioritizing the infrastructure development or realigning public investment in our sort of budgets can pave way for a real successful energy attribute tracking system on ground. I do see the increased demand for RECs within the domestic markets, driven by CBAM compliance, and this can incentivize further investments in RE, accelerating the transition and strengthening energy security. Of course, needless to say that currently, of course, we are only concerned about CBAM and EU. It could be that this preparedness helps us to really penetrate or facilitate our market access in other responsible markets as well going forward. Coming from a trade background, I can envision that future free trade agreements, bilateral or regional, could have elements very similar to CBAM. So our preparedness in this area would really pay off.
Thanks. Thank you, Dr. Vaqar. Thank you so much. And I think hopefully we'll get to see more closer collaboration on this with SDPI as well, and then IREC Foundation also providing support in this area. Jos, I think I have one final question for you, and then we have a Q&A as well from panelists. I think also I'll move more to the tactical point now, and I think having seen how different markets have grown, what steps can Pakistan take, particularly PET, in terms of further helping optimize and streamline the market in Pakistan? Because obviously, as you've seen over the past year, the market has significantly grown, which results in roadblocks and potential hitches in terms of the registration timelines, etc. So, what potential steps can we continue with in Pakistan, given the example of different markets?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so this is a very good question, and to some degree, I think it has some international alignment. So comparing it to other markets, I think definitely first of all, having PAT, having a local entity being responsible for it is already, I think, the largest aspect of creating a very good and vibrant market. I think other things is it's mostly, I think, educational, making people aware that this instrument exists. From the supply side, it is a win-win situation. It is a revenue generating instrument for producers. And especially in Pakistan, there is already demand for it. So it is almost I don't want to oversimplify it, but it's almost a guaranteed additional revenue stream. So I think just continuing making people aware of the possibilities that they have, and making sure that they are in touch with the demand side of that market. So we have a list of participants on our website. There are some entities in Pakistan, but also entities around the world, because you can trade IREX in any market as long as you have an account. And I know PAT is working on other aspects as well that help the Turkish market a lot. So a platform that especially focuses on small users to make it simpler for them to participate, rather than to having to sign up for an international registry, just to work with PAT and keeping it as local as possible. And that was my other point, growing that market. I think the things I just mentioned can be compared in international lines. So local entities working, having good documentation on the website, having education webinars like this, I think are extremely helpful. And the other aspect are, I think, some of the roadblocks that Dr. Vaqar mentioned are very country specific. So there are roadblocks in some IREC countries that don't exist in Pakistan, and some roadblocks in Pakistan that might not exist outside of Pakistan. So I think on those ones, it is those particular roadblocks are to be solved with local entities, and we can. We're happy to be aware of it, and maybe we can help if we know something similar occurred in another country. But I think the involvement of as much as local people as possible and education of these markets will be very good variables for a growing market.
Thanks, Jos. Thank you so much. I think so. Time for a quick Q&A. One pressing question, unsurprisingly, is yours for you. Is that can you explain a bit more on what the reverse CBAM is?
So it is something we came up with because we work very internationally, and especially in countries outside of the EU and the US. While I am myself located in the Netherlands in the EU, and a lot of these international reporting standards are very US and EU centered, because a lot of big corporates are there. They have sort of more years of reporting. So in some of these standards and legislation, it felt sometimes that we were almost the voice of the non-EU and US countries. And therefore, when CBAM was announced, we've received so many questions on what does it mean for my country, and will IREC be possible to adhere to CBAM? And it's unimaginable how many questions we got on that. And then we thought, but EU is not the only country that can make legislation, so why not make something else? And more information on the reverse. It is an idea. It has been shared with a few governments. A few governments in some African countries were enthusiastic as well. And just one possibility is what I mentioned during the webinar, is just putting a minimum, sort of an RPS on international companies, saying, well, if you're in our country, and this of course needs to make sure that it's in line, like a non-discriminatory way. But if you, for example, in an international company that consumes an X amount of power every year, and you take resources, you make use of Pakistan infrastructure, make sure you procure renewables, maybe the first year 20%, and then 30% or 50%. And I think because many of these corporates are already trying to do that because of international voluntary reporting, having this instrument in place, I expect actually not a lot of corporates would protest against it, because it's not a very big request, saying you are an international company in Pakistan and we have an instrument that is used in many countries, so it's not a roadblock to sign up to it. So just make sure that you procure an X percentage of renewables each year. I don't know if this is a good enough explanation. It can be worked out in much more detail, of course, but it's the general thought of putting an incentive to specific companies to sort of to help the market grow.
No, thank you. This was actually very, very helpful. And I think, I mean, the fact that the slogan or the brand that you created, Reverse CBAM, has actually gotten juices flowing, right? I mean, it's, instead of being a punitive measure, we've kind of turned it around towards the markets we're exporting to. So again, or who are procuring from us. So thank you for that. Again, thank you, Dr. Vaqar and Jos, for your time, for taking all the time. This was a very helpful discussion for us. And I believe, we've got the right kind of stakeholders, Dr. Vaqar with SDPI and your gravitas on the policy-making side, and Jos with, the IREC Foundation's experience, just, creating these markets globally. I think looking forward, we can combine both of those, and with PET working together to really catalyze not just the REC market, but also help, catalyze the RE transition in the country. With that, thank you both. I'll hand it back to Mustafa, so take it from here.
Thank you.
Thank you, Hassan. Thank you, Jos. And thank you, Dr. Vaqar, for this. Given Pakistan's acute energy crisis, I'm sure this conversation was very insightful for Pakistani businesses. This brings us to the end of our webinar. And before concluding, I would like to call upon Faiza again. This time, Faiza, it would be great if you could share our vision for 2024 with the audience.
Thank you so much, Usma. So first of all, I would like to thank again all the partners and the speakers who joined us today for the session, and also all the people who are listening in. I'm conscious that they're listening in from different parts of the world in different time zones, but thank you for making it to the webinar. We covered a diverse range of topics in this session, ranging from like a global view on what COP28 entailed and the way forward, how the world is going to progress, but also touched upon more local topics, like, for example, biomass and their localized context. One thing that I noticed and I would like to point out is the focus on the solutions and the very practical discussions that we had in this webinar. And I feel proud that we were able to put this together, because this is exactly what the need of the hour is, as opposed to, for example, debates on the language of a document, for example, or maybe even sessions that lead to a lot of climate anxiety, but not really what can practically be done in terms of curtailing the climate change that is happening. We talked about science-based targets, biomass, renewable energy certificates. We heard it directly from the experts in the field. And I feel that even though there are a lot of challenges, the opportunities that lie ahead of us are equally substantial. In my concluding remarks, I would like to urge all organizations and people who are listening in to commit to tangible actions in 2024 and turn our collective vision into sustainable practices. Usfa, to your comment, some of the exciting things in terms of looking forward from the Net Zero Pakistan's perspective for the next year is that we have talked about the feasibility study of the biomass, national level biomass supply chain for quite a bit of time now, but we're happy to announce that we'll be closing it towards the beginning of the next year, and most likely we'll be kicking off a pilot project on ground, on kind of groundbreaking on the BioVentures project itself. So this is something that we are really excited about. The other thing is that we are also, BioVentures was first of its kind project, and many to come in terms of the ad-scale projects that Net Zero Pakistan plan to launch. And we will be investing in feasibility studies for more ad-scale projects and ideas. So I would also kind of, take this opportunity to invite, more ideas from anybody who's listening in. If you have any idea that is bankable and that is actually green as well, please feel free to reach out to us, and we'll be happy to consider the idea and conduct feasibility studies around your proposal. More on the tackle side, we have discussed, we have deliberated a lot on, how to, for example, measure our emissions and set science-based targets, a lot of work around scope 3 mapping, etc. But I feel that now, as the maturity and the level of expertise of our member companies increase, we need to, for example, create a new curriculum for town halls around disclosure and decarbonization. So we're really kind of, progressing in terms of really basic subjects like scope 1, scope 2, then more complex around scope 3 and SBTI target submission, but now also towards disclosure and transparency. We will also be focusing on upstream supply chain. I'm very cognizant that Net Zero Pakistan works very closely with the tier 1 and tier 2 suppliers, but now in 2024, we will be focusing more on tier 3 and upstream supply chain members in the textile sector. We have already started work on this, we have already done the groundwork in this space by launching the supply engagement tool and sort of, creating that process and system where our members can reach out to and engage with the suppliers in a more standardized format. So that is it from my side. Very excited about 2024 and very happy that we are concluding 2023 on a very good and exciting note. Thank you everyone for joining. Before we drop off, I would like to request all the panel members to switch on their camera so we can take a quick picture and keep this screenshot as a reminder of this amazing webinar. Mustafa, Sherry, Ramin, if you could switch on your cameras for one quick, few quick seconds.
I think we can go ahead and take it.
Yes. Sherry, let us know when the screenshot is done, and then we can call it a day.
Yep, it's done.
Perfect. Thank you so much, everyone. Have a
Thank you,
nice
everyone.
evening, night, wherever you are at. Thank
Thank
you.
you so much.
Thank you so much. Bye.